I mean, if you look at the demographics, it is perfectly reasonable to assume that Putin was going to be the last leader of Russia anyway. A bit of an internal coup in that we had one faction that used to be part of the government take over the government because they thought that the previous two rulers, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, had mismanaged the system so badly that they really needed adults in the room, people who had the full picture of everything that was going on. And in a highly censored totalitarian dictatorship, that meant the intelligence services. So the KGB generated Yuri Chernenko and ultimately Gorbachev, all from the KGB, to run the system. Well, these people stayed in, I wouldn't even call it the background. They weren't officially in charge, but they were always large and present in the 1990s. And when Yeltsin took ill, they're the ones who took over from Yeltsin. So we had a quick revolution, lasted a few years, then Yeltsin got dropped because his health was atrocious. And the KGB has been in the KGB's successor, the FSB, has been in charge of ever since. Now, Putin is obviously from that crowd, but so has everyone around him. Alexei Miller of Gazprom is probably the best example. But the chiefs of all of the major companies that they're called the Siligarchs, the security oligarchs, that have taken over chunks of the Russian economy in large bites ever since 1999. They are all personally beholden to Putin. They are all from that inner circle, and they are all over 50. So there is not a generation waiting in the wings that has been trained. Putin has been very effective at pruning any potential challengers to his rule. So he will be the last capable, competent president of the Russian Federation. Every once in a while, we have a faction within that group that kind of rises to prominence because they want to succeed, and as soon as Putin thinks they might be get closer to succeed him, he smashes them. Right now, we haven't had anybody like that for a few years. The best case scenario is we get something a little bit like what happened after Mao left in China, like a gang of 4 from the different factions who rules as a committee, and then one of the 4 offs the other 3, and then he's in charge. That's kind of the best case scenario now. I think it'd be more likely that Putin has so removed everyone of leadership talent that we're probably going to have more of an organizational collapse. Igor Sechin of Rosneft, that's the state oil company, is probably the most capable who's left, but everyone else of the 150 KGB members that are left so thoroughly hate him in all things that it's really doubtful that he'd be able to rally anyone to his flag. So there really is no one. We look at leadership different than the Russians do. The strongman is who rules Russia. It always has been. The terrain does not lead to regional leaders or regional economics that are separate. So like, here, Texas, New York, California, Florida, Minnesota, these are all discrete economic entities. And so we have a federal system where each of the states chooses their own leadership and then submits their leadership choices at a representative level to Washington. That would never work in the Russian Federation. In the Federation, you've got Moscow, you've got St. Petersburg, and then you have all these secondary cities that are dependent upon some degree of link to one of those two, and all of them have been conquered by Russia over the course of their existence. Every single one of them. Russia is not a republic. It's certainly not a democracy. It's a multi-ethnic empire. And with that sort of political and economic footing, someone's in charge. And if someone's not in charge, no one's in charge. And the future of Russia, in my opinion, is probably going towards the latter. But for now, it means that you have a strongman in the center who appoints regional strongmen, like Kadyrov, to look after things for him. This is not about growth. This is not about jobs. This is not about popularity. This is about control. And from Putin's point of view, choosing Kadyrov's father, because that was who he originally appointed back in 2001 as his successor, was smart because he turned one faction of the Chechens against the other Chechen factions, and together with the Russian military, they were able to break them all. And so that faction was rewarded with control over a personal fiefdom, very medieval, very Middle Ages, very feudalistic. Of course, as will always happen to fathers, they will pass on in time. Kadyrov Sr. was assassinated, and so Kadyrov Jr., the current guy, took over. And yes, this guy is dumb as a bag of snakes. There's no argument there. But he is proven relentlessly capable of keeping Chechnya in line. So Chechnya is no longer functionally part of the Russian Federation from an economic point of view, but the independence push was squelched. And Kadyrov regularly participates with Moscow when it comes to security issues, specifically Putin relies upon the Chechens to assassinate people in Russia who he finds politically inconvenient. The emphasis that American hostage rescuers have on rescuing the hostages, that mindset doesn't really exist in Russia. So the Russian military just gassed the theater and killed 3/4 of the hostages, and then went in with gas masks and shot everyone who had an explosive vest. The conspiracy theory that if you're going to pay attention when you should pay attention to is that back in 1999, a couple of apartment blocks in Moscow were blown up. No one in Chechnya claimed credit for it, and the Chechens had kind of screamed all of their bombings and successes from the rooftops for every other tech they'd ever done. But Putin blamed the Chechens for that and used that to whip up Russian public opinion into a frenzy and launch the Second Chechen War. So did Putin do it to his own people? Considering his ethical standards, I don't think it should be ruled out, but there's certainly no proof one way or the other. This is the middle war. So, Nagorno-Karabakh, Georgia, Crimea, Kazakhstan, these are all kind of in their back pocket now. Ukraine, even control of all of Ukraine doesn't solve the problem on the Western Front. They would, in addition, need Moldova, the northeastern sliver of Romania, that's part of the Bessarabian Gap, that's how the Turks have often invaded. They would also need eastern Poland right up into downtown Warsaw on the Vistula River. That's the Polish Gap. That's where the Nazis like to invade it. And then they would need Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in totality, because that's how the Swedes have gotten in the past. So you're talking about 6 more countries, 5 which are members of NATO. Obviously, that's where things get very dicey. I mean, they can probably capture Moldova in a long weekend, although looking at the military effectiveness so far, maybe I should extend that out to a month.
Yeah, spring break at least.
But for the other 5, if Ukraine is able to keep the fire lit, then the Russians aren't going to have enough conventional forces to do this. And the only thing worse than having a Russia that didn't try to do this and just kind of shrivels in time would be a Russia that leapt forward, launched the war, paid all the prices for the war, and still remains strategically unmoored. So there's a point we're going to get to in a few months, probably later this year, certainly next year, where the Russians will have digested Ukraine and Moldova to their satisfaction, their plan, and then they'll have that clash with NATO. And that's when the nukes become a very real question. Think about what the Russians did in Crimea. They started moving in troops. It was apparent that the populations were Russified enough that they were not going to resist. And when talk in the West started coming around about, we're going to back dissident forces like, say, the Crimean Tatars, who are basically Turkish, the Russians snarled, well, that will mean an end to all energy and imports from the West energy exports from Russia into Europe. At which point, Angela Merkel, in one of her more ignoble moments, said, no, Crimea is Russia's. We will have a level of sanctions that will not approach anything that causes economic pain to either side, and we are going to call it there. That is no longer an option. So strategic weapons are now on the table for that threat.